Okay, let's have a look at another decisive game from the recent Tal Memorial. This time it was Boris Gelfand against Sergey Karjakin, one of the youngsters of the tournament, who's 2763, not a bad rating for a youngster. So against Boris, much more experienced player, who played d4. We have soon the popular Catalan, so g3, we're in Catalan territory. Sergey doesn't do anything that original now. He plays d5, so not particularly hyper modern. He's occupying the centre with pawns, creating a fixed blockade against that bishop. Or is it going to be a liability, this pawn on d5? Well, after bishop g2, bishop e7, now we see knight f3. So the pawn's offered actually here, but it's not taken in this position. I think white will be able to do something quite interesting if it is taken immediately here. The king's still in the centre, so maybe even queen a4. In fact, let's just check d takes c4 here, the worth of this gambit. Is it queen a4 check, or is it something else which could be good? Maybe even just knight bd2 here. And white should be getting the pawn back with an okay position. It's too dangerous to try and hold on to the pawn. But after castles, now actually the pawn is taken. So black knows he's just going to let that pawn go. But what is he going to get in return? After queen c2, he plays actually a6. So a6 will mean that b5 will gain a tempo if the queen takes on c4, and that will support bishop b7, which eyes up this bishop. And if that bishop is exchanged off, then of course white will be left with some weaknesses around his king, potentially. For the moment, white plays a4, cutting off that plan, but the bishop now comes to d7, so it's still going to be eyeing the fianchetto bishop on g2. Queen takes c4, bishop c6. So it looks as though black has a solid position. He's provoked a4 from white, which might mean b4 is going to be weak in the future, a square to potentially use in the future. But white has a lot of pressure here. The semi-open c5 in particular looks to be pretty good after, say, bishop f4. If white can develop harmoniously, it looks as though white enjoys a pleasant position here. Bishop f4, and now black actually does seal the b4 square here with a5, marking that b4 square for potential use with say a knight manoeuvre like that, knight a6 to b4. In fact, after knight c3, knight a6 is played, knight e5, offering bishop's exchange. The bishop is a kind of barrier on the c file. So if white wants more c-file pressure, maybe it is logical to try and get rid of that bishop. Bishop takes g2, king takes g2. So there looks to be a lot of pressure here on black, and this knight might not be ideally placed if it immediately goes to b4. In fact, Sergey here plays on a different aspect of the position. Now this bishop might actually be a vulnerability. As we've seen in another recent video, actually, the bishop on f4 has been troublesome for some of the white players. It was in the game Naka against Coulson that the bishop was attacked with g5, but here the bishop's attacked with knight d5, and in fact it's not moved, and I wonder if that was a little mistake here. Should white allow these pawns to be doubled? What does our engine friend Houdini think of this position? She thinks maybe taking the knight, or rook c1, or bishop d2, just retreating the bishop with a small advantage, perhaps a tiny advantage. So even if knight b6, queen d3, queen's getting kicked around, but it should be okay for white. Okay. So in the game, I don't know if this is a little bit controversial. It looks slightly suspect. to allow the double pawns, but of course white has dynamic possibilities along the G file, and with that knight being wiped out, there's less defensive resources for black's king. Bishop d6, and now rook d3, as though this G file is going to be dangerous. There's possibilities to attack, so it looks like quite a bit of fun potentially on the cards. So some careful clinical defence is needed. This knight needs to be evicted, but at the moment evicting the knight drops e6. Perhaps this next move is designed mainly with the idea of evicting the knight with f6. Queen e8 was played. Now after rook f3, is f6 on the cards here, or is it too dangerous? In the game actually knight b4 was played, so I wonder here if f6 was possible, if black did want to try and evict the knight. f6, knight d3, maybe it doesn't really matter, but white seems to enjoy a small advantage coming back like this with knight c5. Okay, maybe it's no big deal. Bishop takes, it looks like about equal. Well, in the game, Sergey had chosen knight b4, so he's got the option now of kicking that knight. So where is white's dynamism for the double pawns? Well, he's still got also semi-open c-file pressure. So if there's actually knight b5, and the knight is kicked now with f6. Okay, so knight d3, and now an exchange of knights, and rook d8. So it looks as though black is transcending into simplifying the position, with white's pawn structure still having the double pawns. So are these going to be good or bad, these double pawns? Rook h3, rather crude looking move, going in for the attack, forcing a concession of some sort from black. Black plays f5, which fixes f4, of course. Is it a big problem to have this pawn seemingly backward? There's a pawn here, so there's no frontal pressure on that pawn. There is a possibility of d5 undermining f5. For the moment, Boris played actually e3, and I wonder if this game was kind of experimentation, because he's going to, he's earned the right to challenge Alan. I'm not sure he was out to play his absolute best game. There might have been an element of experimentation, because it seems a bit odd to have a rook like this. Okay, it's seemingly attacking rook, but a bit decentralized. If black can neatly centralize his pieces, it's going to make this rook look a little bit silly, potentially. Queen c6 check, and now actually preserving the bishop and with bishop b4. And I don't know, there might be an implication of rook f6 to g6 here, if black wants to have the option of exchange of rooks, something like that. So rook g3 was played though. Queen d7, as though the knight might be evicted soon with c6, or there might be c5 or c6 and c5. In fact, after queen b3, c6 was used, and now keeping a grip on d5 actually from white. I think c5 might run into d5. Black actually plays b5, and if we're left with 2-1, that might be an interesting pawn majority for one day, creating an outside pass pawn. White plays now rook c1 and now rook b8, so it's a bit of queenside tension, and this rook, it seems to be locked out of the game. The pieces are not seemingly the greatest of teams here with this rook on g3. A takes b, c takes, so we've got a 2-1 pawn majority as well. Now d5, okay, which does seem quite an aggressive break, but rook f e8 is played, and white takes on e6, queen takes, and now knight d5, which seems to introduce some major threats actually, that this rook's not so bad eyeing g7 if it can be joined with this other guy. And there's also lurking threats like knight f6 to be considered as well now. In fact, knight f6 is an immediate threat because the queen's like pinned to the king, so knight f6 is actually immediately threatening to win the exchange, and it's probably against this threat that king h8 is partly used. So it seems safe enough now, but this rook coordination finally, this rook which was out in the wilderness is now coordinating with the other rook for g7. Black now very calmly plays rook bd8, and I think there's a tactical reason here why, which I've checked on the previous day actually, why rook takes g7 is not possible. Let's just engine check this. In the game actually e4 was played, but if we consider a rook capture on g7, I think it's a disaster, because black has a tactical response here which not only saves the position, it just wins the position. Rook g8, so it's pinning the rook against the king and forcibly winning material because the knight's loose, so check and then taking the knight with either rook or queen. Actually queen takes d5 looks to be more accurate, and there's horrible threats as well. So white cannot take on g7. He plays actually e4, which is an interesting tactical move in its own right, and I think this does unveil the possibility of a rook takes g7 now if it was taken. Hang on, let's just check. Takes rook g7 is answerable in this position now because e4 had liberated for the queen to now come to g3, which wasn't possible before. e4 facilitating queen g3, and this is better for white apparently. So say here, even though it looks as though it might be still vulnerable, rook g5, and that's fine for white. Okay, so in this position after e4, it looks as though is white's dynamism really being proven. But look at the elegance of black's pieces in the centre. If black can somehow defend this position, his pawn structure would be superior still. He plays actually bishop f8, which seems to meet the task of defending g7 adequately. But g7 is further attacked now. Queen c3. The queen is attacked, it's moved to d4, still eyeing that g7. So we do have, from before, a seemingly more cohesive team of pieces, white pieces here, coordinating at least on g7. Rook d7, defending against g7 again. Queen a7, seemingly very forcible move. Okay, but it's possible now for black to just take on c7 and rely now on this pin with queen f7, pinning the knight against the queen, but dropping a5 it seems. So here really it's an exchange of a flank pawn for a centre pawn, which would further actually emphasise this damaged pawn structure. Queen takes a5, but for the moment actually it's not so simple it seems. Of course there's knight takes rook now, but what if rook takes e4? Was that actually playable? Rook takes e4. In the game a different move was chosen here, rook c8. Now is that actually much better than rook takes e4? Let's just check this position. Rook takes e4 is given as a reasonable move actually. Knight d5, and it should be okay for black. What was played? Rook c8 here is also, I guess, a good move. It's one of the better moves. Rook c8 as well as rook e4. They're both strong moves, but rook c8 actually might be good because of it means that f takes e4 actually. If white wants to play f takes e4, he can here, and that pawn might be very useful. So maybe that's actually the best move. The way of playing this is to facilitate f takes e4. So knight d5, f takes e4. So we do have virtually a trade of a flank pawn when the queen took there for white's centre pawn. So we've got these two pawns, which seem to be very good. This fractured structure still. Okay, the knight goes to blockade on e3. If queen takes b4, there's queen d5. If knight b4, that probably ran into big trouble here. Knight takes b4. I think tactically it looks suspect for rook c1, say knight takes b4. Check. Okay, here queen c4, and it looks as though big danger, as well as hitting b4, threatening queen f1. Not very good. Okay, so white tries to keep things under control with knight e3, but f4 is dropping. So black finally looks to be a clear pawn up. Queen d5, and now bishop d6, coordinating bishop and queen. Once the queen moves, the rook's going to be attacked by the bishop. Queen b7, hitting g7, threatening mate. That's defended now, but also unveiling the attack on the rook. The rook goes to h3. It's still a bit cut off over there. Rook e8, but sort of annoying because it hasn't been able to be that easily refuted. But white is a pawn down now, with black in a commanding position overall. So rook h5, queen f3, hitting the rook. Rook g5, threatening mate again. Okay, that's defended with rook g8. Queen c6, it looks as though white's being a real nuisance here. Where does this bishop go now? It's protected, actually, and h2 is attacked at the same time. Rook g2, defending h2. Now bishop e5, trying to nab the pawn. It's sort of defending the pawn, counter-attack on white's b pawn with queen c4. The b pawn is protected, thus emphasising again the attack on b2. The pawn's moved. Now some air for the king is made, h6. Okay, so white's in a difficult position of pawn down. He plays on, he plays rook g3. The weakness of the last move, of course, is that f2 can be attacked now. Well, the rook defending f2. So the rook just goes back to g2 now. This is move 51 now. So white's a bit passive. Rook a8 looks dangerous now for the back row. Queen c6, check. Queen f5. Now this looks like a subtly strong move. Queen f5. What is the point exactly of queen f5? In this position, what is actually going on? Black looks to be a pawn up. Queen f5 is actually giving us one of the stronger moves. Queen f5, queen b6, with the idea of bishop takes h2 here, which wasn't actually played in the game. That's very, very interesting. In this position, rook d1 was played, but let's have a look at bishop takes h2. So if king takes h2, I guess rook takes f1. No, check. Check. And this does look pretty dangerous. If king h3, rook takes f1. And if f4, this looks to be the end of white's king safety anyway. So what of the other way, I wonder? So bishop takes h2, rook takes h2. Check. Is there a nasty tactic here? Yes. There's rook takes f1. So even a 2-7-6-3 can miss these tactics, these tactical ideas. So it seems bishop takes h2 was a major shot in this position after queen b6, and it was missed by Sergey Karjakin, who's 2763. Instead, he plays rook d1. Okay, but still black's better. Queen a6, defending f1 now securely. Okay, bit of prophylaxis, better late than never. Bishop d4, queen comes back. It's still very passive for white, and a pawn down, and soon maybe to be another pawn down. Rook d3 hitting b3, rook g3 defending against that, afforded by the queen supporting f2 of course, otherwise it wouldn't have been possible. Rook c3. Okay, pressure's being put on white here. Queen d2. Bishop now kicks the rook, or provokes a reaction to attack white. The queen's attacked, but after queen e6, it seems the rook is attacked and also b3 is falling off. So here actually white decided enough was enough and resigned. Let's just check the final position here. So say rook g2. I think just taking on b3 is safe enough with the queen, but what if the rook out of interest? It's still okay either way. So it'll be 2 pawns up. Okay, so that was an interesting game with the Catalan. With white accepting, maybe controversially, the double pawns, he did seem to have dangerous dynamism for quite a while in the game though, to compensate for the double pawns. And at one point it seemed the rooks weren't talking to each other, the white rooks, but eventually, and I think this d5 break assisted, the rooks started talking to each other. But it seems adequate defense all the time, even with this very resourceful move e4, which really did threaten rook takes g7 because of queen g3. Even with that, it seems black had the better of it, was able to sort of get now centre pawn for a flank pawn and be a pawn up. So once he's a pawn up, that double pawn was actually a real weakness as well. Now exposed here, this f4 really weak. So that did represent a pawn loss, and then a tactic was missed pretty soon in this position. After queen b6 there was actually bishop takes h2, a remarkable tactic. Instead rook d1 was played, but still black was better. He's winning another pawn by force. After queen e6, Boris decided to resign. Well, I hope you got something from that. They'll shortly, I think I'll try and for a playlist of all the decisive games once all of them are covered from Tal Memorial. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks so much.